The last bag hit the floorboards with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Inez Lockhart stood in the doorway of the only home she had known for 6 years, her knuckles white around the worn leather handle of her traveling case, her jaw set so hard her teeth ached. The morning sun was barely above the ridge, and already the heat was pressing down on Redemption Flats, Texas, like a thumb on a bruise. She did not look back at the empty bedroom. She did not look at the cold hearth, or the curtains she had sewn herself from grain sacking in the early lean years. She looked only at the wagon she had loaded before dawn, the one she intended to drive north to Abilene, where she had a cousin she had not written to in 3 years, and a future that was nothing more than a blank, terrifying page. She was 31 years old, widowed 4 months ago, and she was done. The debt notice from the Cattlemen's Bank of Redemption Flats was still folded in the pocket of her brown wool skirt. $340. Walter Lockhart, her late husband, had borrowed against the land, against the cattle, against the very walls around her, and he had never once told her. She had found out the way she found out most things in her marriage too late, and from a stranger's mouth. In this case, the stranger had been Harlan Mote, the bank president, who had delivered the notice personally, and with such obvious satisfaction that Inez had suspected for a long time afterward that Harlan Mote had been waiting for this day since the moment she had turned down his courtship 12 years prior. She was leaving because she had no choice. That was what she told herself as she stepped off the porch and crossed the dry yard. She was leaving because the land was already as good as Harlan Mote's, because the cattle were fewer than 10 head and not worth fighting for, because staying meant watching everything she had built decay into dust beneath his grasping hands. She was 3 steps from the wagon when a shadow fell across the yard from the direction of the road. A man on a dun-colored horse came through the gap in the fence where the gate had blown off its hinges 2 winters ago, and Walter had never fixed it. He was lean the way men who traveled too far and ate too little became lean, with a dark hat pulled low, and a week's worth of stubble on a jaw that was nonetheless somehow clean in its lines. His coat was trail-worn and his boots were cracked at the toe. He had a bedroll tied behind his saddle and a rifle in the scabbard and nothing else that she could see. He stopped his horse 10 feet away and looked at the loaded wagon, and then at her, and then at the bag in her hand. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned that most things resolved themselves if you gave them enough quiet. "The road is that way," Inez said, and pointed past him without softening it. He did not move. He looked again at the wagon, at the house, at the sky going gold and wide above the ridge. Then he looked at her with a directness that she found instantly annoying. "You the widow Lockhart?" he asked, her spine straightened. "Who's asking?" "Name's Andrew Calloway," he said. "I knew your husband." The bag nearly slipped from her hand. 3 weeks earlier, Inez had sat at the kitchen table she now owned for another 30 days at most, reading by lamplight the only document Walter had ever left her that was worth something. It was not a deed, not a will, not an apology. It was a letter half-finished, blotted, written in his awkward hand, and it was addressed to a man named Andrew Calloway, General Delivery, San Angelo. In the letter, Walter had written that he owed Calloway a debt of conscience and that he intended to make it right before winter. He had died in October from a fever that moved so fast she had barely had time to understand it was mortal before it was over. She had never sent the letter. She had not known the man, had not known what debt Walter meant, and grief had swallowed the first weeks whole. But she had kept the letter because throwing it away had felt like one more thing she could not afford to lose. And now here was the man himself, sitting a horse in her yard on the morning she was leaving forever, and looking at her like he knew something important. She squared her shoulders. "You have got about 2 minutes of my time," she said. "I have a long drive ahead." Andrew Calloway swung down from the horse with the economical grace of someone who had done it 10,000 times, looped the reins over the broken fence post, and removed his hat. His hair was dark brown, and his eyes, she saw when he was no longer half-shadowed by the brim, were a particular shade of gray-green that she associated with deep river water. He was perhaps 33 or 34. There were no fresh lines of cruelty in his face, only the ordinary marks of weather and distance. "I'll be brief," he said. "I heard in town this morning that the bank is taking the property. I came to find Walter and I found out he's gone instead." He paused, and she saw something move behind his eyes, a brief and private grief she had not expected. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said, because those were the words, and then she waited. "Walter borrowed money from me back in 1878, Andrew said. "Not from a bank, from me personally. $400 on a handshake." The number hit her like a cold wind. "I never knew about any such arrangement." "I know you didn't," he said, and there was no accusation in it. Walter was the kind of man who kept his debts in separate pockets. She felt a surge of something hot and complicated rise in her chest. She had been managing her grief and her anger about Walter's hidden debts for months, and she was very tired of both. "If you've come to collect from a widow who is in the process of being foreclosed on, I would suggest you enjoy the land because the bank is taking it and there is no money left." "I haven't come to collect," Andrew said quietly. "I've come because I think Walter owed you an explanation that he never gave you, and because I may be able to help. If you'll give me more than 2 minutes." Inez looked at him for a long moment. The wagon sat waiting. Abilene sat north and far away and uncertain. The house sat behind her with its cold hearth and its empty larder and its 6 years of history, good and bad and mostly hard. "There's coffee," she said finally, which was not a yes but was as close as she intended to get without hearing more. "If you want it." She turned and walked back to the porch, and after a moment she heard his boot heels follow her across the dry yard. The kitchen was almost bare. She had packed the good Dutch oven and the second quilt and the small cedar box that held her mother's silver thimble. What remained was the 2-burner stove that was too heavy to haul, the tin coffee pot, 2 cups, and a table that had witnessed more arguments than she cared to count. She set the coffee to warm on the stove and pulled out a chair but did not sit. Andrew Calloway sat across from her and set his hat on the table and looked around the kitchen with the particular expression of a man cataloging absence. "Tell me about this debt," she said. He folded his hands on the table. They were working hands, scarred at the knuckles, strong in the way that came from actual labor and not performance. "Walter and I were trail hands together on the good night loving in 1876, he said. "Drove cattle up to Colorado. He was good company, good with horses, lousy with money, a faint pull at the corner of his mouth that might have been a smile's ghost. After the drive he wanted to start his own spread, said he had a woman back home he was going to marry." Inez said nothing. She knew she was that woman. "He didn't have the stake. I did. I'd been careful. I lent it to him because I believed in him and because I was 25 and still thought believing in people was enough." He stopped and she saw him decide against whatever he had been about to add. "He sent payments for 2 years. Then they stopped. I wrote 3 times and got no answers. Life moved on and I let it go." "And now?" she asked. "Now I'm 40 miles through on a drift north from El Paso and I'm stopping in Redemption Flats to look at some land." He met her eyes. "Heard the Lockhart place might be coming available." She felt the edge of something she could not yet name. "You came to buy the land." "I came to inquire," he said carefully. "I didn't know the situation until I got into town and people talked. I didn't know Walter was dead. I didn't know what he'd done to the property's finances." He paused. "I didn't know you." The coffee began to boil. Inez poured 2 cups and set one in front of him without ceremony, and sat down across from him, and wrapped her hands around her own cup, and looked at the man across from her. He was not what she expected a drifter to look like, although she was aware that was a foolish expectation to have, since drifters looked like every kind of person that necessity had put in motion. He had about him a quality of stillness that she recognized as something earned rather than born. Men who were born still were dull. Men who had earned stillness had usually survived something. "What kind of land are you looking for?" she asked. "Grazing land," he said. "Something with water access." I've been working other men's spreads for years. I'm done with that. I want my own. This land has water access, she said. The creek runs year-round. I tested it through 3 droughts. Something shifted in his expression. I know, he said. Walter told me about the creek when he was trying to convince me to lend the money. He made it sound like paradise. It's not paradise, Inez said. The summers are brutal, the winters are bitter, the grass is thin in years without rain, and the nearest town is 7 miles over a road that turns to soup in spring. She paused. But the creek is exactly as good as he said. Andrew Calloway looked at her steadily. Are you trying to talk me out of it or into it? I don't know yet, she said, and was surprised to find that this was the truth. She had packed her bags. She had made her decision in the gray hours before dawn with the kind of cold clarity that grief eventually produces when it burns long enough. She was going to Abilene. She was going to find her cousin Marjorie and start something new and leave all of this particular sorrow behind. But here was a man who had known Walter before she had, who understood some part of the man she had spent 6 years trying to fully comprehend, and who was sitting at her table drinking bad coffee with no apparent agenda beyond the one he had already stated, and she found that she did not immediately want him to leave. This disturbed her considerably. Tell me about the debt, she said again from a different angle. What you really meant when you said Walter owed me an explanation. Andrew set down his cup. He looked at the table for a moment and then back at her. When Walter came to me in 1876 wanting the loan, he told me things about his plans. Things he said he hadn't been able to tell you yet because he wanted to have them settled before he did. Her breath caught. What things? He was in trouble before he was ever in the black on this land, Andrew said quietly. There were debts from before your marriage, from before I knew him. Men he owed in Austin, not honest creditors the other kind. He borrowed from me to get clear of them, not to build the ranch. He used part of what I gave him to buy himself safe passage out of a situation that would have killed him if he'd stayed. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a mockingbird was running through its catalog of borrowed songs in the mesquite tree. He never told me, Inez said. Her voice was absolutely level. She had spent 4 months learning to say difficult things in a level voice, and she was very practiced now. He intended to, Andrew said. He told me he would tell you everything once it was behind him, once he'd paid me back and gotten clear. He never paid you back, she said, and he never told me. No, Andrew said simply. She stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the wagon. The sun was fully up now, the heat building in the way that it did in late July in this part of Texas, shimmering and relentless. The horse she'd hitched that morning was switching its tail at flies. That money you lent him, she said, still facing the window. $400. He used it to escape debts he made before we were married, not to build what he promised you, and not to build what he promised me. Yes, Andrew said. He did not soften it or qualify it, and she was grateful for that. And you came here to buy the land, she said. I came here initially to find Walter, he corrected. What happens now is a different question. She turned from the window. What does happen now, Mr. Calloway? He picked up his hat from the table and turned it once in his hands and set it down again. It was the first uncertain gesture she had seen from him, and it made him somehow more real. I have a proposal, he said. You can tell me it's foolish or insulting or both, and I'll ride on without argument. She waited. The bank is taking the land for $340, he said. I have more than that, not much more, but more. I could pay the debt directly and save the foreclosure. The breath went out of her. Why in the world would you do that? Because Walter owed me $400, he said. And this way I consider the debt closed in a way that benefits you rather than Harlan Mote, who I've been in town long enough to learn is not a man who ought to profit further at your expense. That's charity, she said, and she put into those 2 words everything she felt about receiving charity, which was a very great deal. It's not, Andrew said. It would be a business arrangement, a partnership. A partnership, she repeated. I have the cash, but I don't have the land or the knowledge of it, or the connections in this county, or the house that's already standing on it, he said. You have the land, or you would have it if the debt is paid, and you know every inch of this property, and you know this county, and you have 6 years of work already done. Together those things are worth more than either is separately. Inez Lockhart looked at the man across her kitchen table and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not desire. Not yet. She was a practical woman, and that came later if at all, but something more fundamental and more threatening. She felt seen. "We are strangers," she said. "We were strangers an hour ago," he said. "We're somewhat less so now." "A partnership in what exactly?" she asked. "The land, the cattle, the ranch," he said simply. "A real one. What Walter promised you it would be, from what I understand." She pulled in a long, slow breath. Outside, her horse switched its tail again. The wagon sat loaded with everything she owned that she had been able to carry. Abilene sat north and blank and full of the particular loneliness of starting over in someone else's place. "Give me until tomorrow morning," she said. Something in his expression relaxed just slightly, just enough for her to catch it. "I'll sleep in the barn," he said. "If that's acceptable." "The barn roof leaks in the southeast corner," she said. "The northwest side is dry." He picked up his hat and stood. "Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Lockhart." "It was terrible coffee," she said. "I used the last of the good grounds yesterday." The faintest pull at the corner of his mouth again. She watched him go, and then she sat back down at the kitchen table with her empty cup and her loaded wagon waiting outside, and an entirely different kind of future suddenly sitting at the edge of her vision like a word she could not quite bring herself to say yet. She sat there for a long time. It was the land that decided her. This she admitted to herself with complete honesty in the hour before midnight, when she finally stopped trying to sleep and sat up with her back against the headboard in the dark. She had told herself for months that she did not love this land, that she was ready to leave it, that Abilene was a fresh start and not a retreat. But sitting in the dark with the sounds of the Texas night coming through the window, the coyotes on the ridge, the creek running low and steady 200 yards east, the mesquite breathing warm in the darkness, she knew she had been lying. She loved this land the way you loved something you had fought for and suffered with and never quite conquered. She loved the creek that ran year-round. She loved the ridge in the evening light. She loved the garden plot she had dug herself in the first spring when Walter had said there was no water to spare for vegetables, and she had hauled it by hand from the creek and proven him wrong every summer since. She loved the work of it, the physical honest dailiness of keeping a place alive in hard country. She did not love what the land had become under debt and disappointment. She did not love what it reminded her of. But the land itself, the actual red clay earth and the grama grass and the sky that went forever overhead, that she loved with a fierceness that surprised her every time she looked at it squarely. Andrew Calloway's proposal was either a lifeline or a trap, and she was experienced enough in the ways things went wrong to know she could not yet tell which. But she had looked at him across the kitchen table for an hour, and she had not caught him in a single lie, and she had become, in 6 years of a complicated marriage, very good at detecting them. She made her decision at 2 in the morning and slept until 5 and woke up certain. She was keeping the land. She was taking the partnership. She was unpacking the wagon. She found Andrew at the creek when the sun was just clearing the ridge, crouching at the bank with his hat off, washing his face in the cold water. He heard her coming and stood and turned without startlement, which told her something about his alertness and his control of himself. "I'll stay," she said, "but I want terms and I want them written." He nodded. "That's fair." "The land stays in my name," she said, "or both our names if the bank requires a single title holder to be a man, which they likely will, but the deed reflects my equal ownership in writing. We work it together, all decisions made together. Revenue split equally after expenses." "Agreed," he said. "You sleep in the barn until such time as other arrangements make sense," she said, and was aware of the color that rose in her face and ignored it entirely. "This is a business arrangement." "Agreed," he said again with the same simple directness. "And you tell me everything you know about Walter and his history," she said. "Everything. I spent 6 years married to a man who kept secrets, and I will not have secrets on my own land. Something moved across his face at that, not guilt, she thought, but recognition. Everything I know, he agreed. Though I should warn you, some of it isn't pleasant. I have been living in unpleasant for 4 months, she said. I can manage more. He offered his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and even, and he released it without holding on, which she noticed and filed away. They walked back to the yard together, and she began to unpack the wagon, and he helped without being asked, carrying the heavy things without comment, and they arranged themselves in the strange new choreography of two people who had agreed to trust each other without yet knowing whether that trust would hold. Redemption Flats was a town of approximately 400 souls situated on the western edge of Comanche County, Texas, in the summer of 1882, and it had an opinion about everything. The widow Lockhart forming a business partnership with a drifter stranger was an opinion-generating event of the highest order. Inez heard the talk on her first trip into town 3 days after Andrew's arrival. She went to Garrity's general store for flour and salt, and the particular kind of corned beef that would get them through while they took stock of the cattle situation, and she endured the sideways looks and the careful questions from Delia Garrity, who was the store owner's wife and the most enthusiastic conduit of gossip in the county. "Is it true you've taken in a drifter?" Delia asked, measuring out the flour with an expression of theatrical concern. "I've taken on a business partner," Inez said. "His name is Andrew Calloway, and he knew my husband from his trail driving days. He has the capital to resolve the bank situation, and I have the land and the knowledge of it." "The bank situation," Delia repeated, and Inez saw her cataloging this carefully for later distribution. "The foreclosure," Inez said, because she was tired of euphemisms. "Harlan Moat won't be taking my land, Delia. Please make sure that travels as far as the gossip about Mr. Calloway." Delia's eyebrows went up and then down, and then she smiled with sudden genuine warmth. "I never did like Harlan Moat," she said, and packed the flour with greater enthusiasm than before. It was Andrew himself who went to the bank. Inez had offered to come, and he had said, with a matter-of-fact directness that she was learning was characteristic of him, that Harlan Moat would negotiate more civilly without her in the room, because men like Harlan Moat used the presence of a woman as an opportunity for performance rather than for business. She had bristled at this, and then recognized it as accurate, and accepted it with the pragmatism that hard years had built into her character. Andrew came back from town in the early afternoon with a receipt in his hand and the foreclosure notice marked paid. He set them on the kitchen table where the debt notice had lived for weeks and looked at her. "It's done," he said. She picked up the receipt and read it twice. $340. The debt Walter had hidden from her, paid by a man she had known for 4 days. Her throat worked briefly and she controlled it. "Thank you," she said. "It's a business arrangement," he said, which was what she had said to him, and she looked up and found that there was something in his eyes that might have been a careful kind of warmth, controlled and watchful, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "Yes," she said, "it is." They ate dinner together that evening at the kitchen table, the first proper dinner she had cooked since before Walter died, salt pork and beans, and the dense corn bread she made from the remaining good meal, and the wild onions she'd pulled from the creek bank that morning. It was plain food, but it was made with attention, and it was hot. Andrew ate with the appetite of a man who had been managing on trail rations and said nothing false about the food. He said, "This is good," and she believed him because he said it once, straightforwardly, without the performance of compliment. "Tell me about yourself," she said, "before the trail drives, before Walter." He was quiet for a moment in the way she was learning meant he was deciding how much of the truth to give. "I grew up in Missouri," he said, "outside Springfield. My father ran a small farm. I left when I was 18. He paused. The war had been over 10 years by then, but it hadn't really finished in that part of the state. Old grudges, old violence. I went west because I needed to be somewhere the past was less immediate." "What past?" she asked. He looked at her across the table. My father chose a side in the war that cost him neighbors, he said. It cost me things too. I'd rather be somewhere that didn't know what side my father chose. She nodded slowly. She understood the weight of inherited history. She had grown up in a household in Georgia that had opinions about the war that pressed down on every ordinary day, and she had come to Texas partly for the same reason he'd gone west. The frontier had that quality, the willingness, if not to forgive the past, at least to let a person exist a little ahead of it. "Are you a wanted man?" she asked directly because it needed to be asked. "No," he said with the same directness. "I've done nothing illegal. I've done some things I'm not proud of and a few things I am. That's the ordinary accounting." "Fair enough," she said. "What about you?" he asked. "Before Walter." She considered. "I was born in Savannah," she said. "My father was a merchant who lost everything after the war. My mother died of fever when I was 12. I came to Texas with a family friend when I was 19, intending to find work as a school teacher. I met Walter at a church social in Abilene in 1875 and was married within 6 months because I was 24 in Texas and the choice seemed right at the time." "Was it?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "Some of it," she said honestly. Walter was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one. He made choices out of fear and called them practicality and never told me the truth about any of it, which is perhaps the kindest description I can give. Andrew said nothing to this, but he nodded, and she had the sense that he was honoring both the loss and the complexity of it, which was more than most people had managed to do. Over the following weeks, they established their routines with the unspoken negotiations that practical people conduct through action rather than conversation. Andrew was up before her, which she found in the first days mildly irritating and then accepted as useful, since he had already checked on the horses and assessed the fence line by the time she had the coffee going. She managed the garden and the smokehouse and the accounts. He managed the cattle, 8 head, as it turned out, not 10, 2 having wandered through the broken fence in the spring and not been recovered, and the structural repairs that the property had been silently accumulating. He fixed the gate first. She watched him do it one morning from the porch, watched the methodical economy of his movements, the way he worked without wasted effort, and she thought about Walter who had put off that gate for 3 winters, and she did not say anything out loud, but she felt something shift in her chest that she refused to name. The fence along the north pasture came next, 4 days of hard work that he did mostly alone, because Inez had her hands full with the final canning of the summer garden. And when it was done, he came in at evening sunburned and exhausted and ate everything on the plate and said nothing about how much work it had been, which told her plenty. On Sunday of the 3rd week, she found herself sitting on the porch in the evening with a cup of coffee she had made correctly this time, using the good ground she had bought on her last trip to town, and Andrew sat in the other chair she had brought out for no particular reason, and they watched the sun go down over the ridge together without speaking for a long time. And this, she realized with some alarm, was the most content she had felt in longer than she could accurately remember. She pushed the thought away. Business arrangement, she pushed it away again. In early August, trouble arrived in the form of 2 men on good horses who came up the road and tied up at the fence and stated they were working for a cattle broker named Silas Drummond out of Abilene, and that they had some questions about certain animals that had been driven through this county in the spring. Inez came to the door at the sound of voices and found Andrew talking to them from the yard, easy in his posture, watchful in his eyes. She could see even from the porch that something was wrong with the situation, something in the way the 2 men arranged themselves at angles, and the way the conversation had the shape of an interrogation wearing a civil face. She came down the porch steps and stood beside Andrew without being asked. The taller of the 2 men looked at her with the calculation men sometimes applied to women in difficult situations, trying to determine whether she was an asset or liability. She met his eyes and kept them, and he looked away first. "Mrs. Lockhart," Andrew said, and there was something in his tone she had not heard before, a careful, deliberate steadiness, as if he were balancing something fragile. "These men are asking about the origin of our cattle." "Our cattle," she noted, and he had said it naturally and correctly. She looked at the men. "Our cattle were born on this land or purchased from the Delacroix Ranch in Comanche County. You can speak to Roy Delacroix, he keeps records." "It's not current stock we're concerned with," the taller man said. He had pale eyes and a pleasant enough manner that fit his face poorly, like borrowed clothes. "There were animals driven through this region in March. We have reason to believe some of those animals were our client's property." "March," Inez said. "My husband died in October. I was alone here in March, and I have no knowledge of any cattle being driven through this property." The two men looked at each other. Something passed between them. "And you, Mr. Calloway?" The pale-eyed man said. "Where were you in March?" "El Paso," Andrew said. "I can give you names." The men stayed another few minutes asking questions that circled back on themselves and got nowhere, and then they left, and Inez and Andrew stood in the yard and watched the dust settle behind their horses on the road. "What was that actually about?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Andrew said, and she could tell he was being completely honest, but that the honest answer was also incomplete. "I don't have any connection to stolen cattle or Silas Drummond, if that's what you're wondering." "I wasn't wondering," she said, which was almost true. She was a practical woman, and she had considered it for 30 seconds and then set it aside, because the man had been living on her property for 3 weeks, and nothing had indicated hidden motives beyond the ones he'd already shown her plainly. "I was wondering what they were really looking for." "So was I," he said. It turned out, 2 weeks later through the county gossip network that Delia Garrity ran with remarkable efficiency, that the two men had been to every spread in the county and several across the county line, and had found nothing. And the word was that Silas Drummond was fishing without knowing where the fish were, and that the matter was most likely resolved. Inez filed this information and moved on. What she could not file away so easily was the thing that happened on the evening the men came. After they had gone and she and Andrew had stood in the yard, and she had been certain enough of him to say without hesitation that she was not wondering about his honesty. After all of that, Andrew had looked at her for a long moment in the settling dust with the particular expression of a man who had not expected to be trusted and did not quite know what to do with it. He had said quietly, "Thank you, Inez," first name, first time the 3 weeks elapsed. She had said, "You're welcome, Andrew," and gone inside, and stood at the stove for a good 5 minutes doing nothing before she recovered herself. September came and cooled the air by precise degrees, the brutal summer releasing its grip on the land with the reluctant grandeur of something that has been winning for months and knows it. The garden was put up, all of it, tomatoes and beans and the squash she had grown from seeds her mother had sent her before her mother died, seeds she had been carrying and replanting for years. The smokehouse was full. The fence was sound. The cattle were 12 head now, Andrew having identified and purchased a small lot of good stock from a rancher 20 miles east who was selling out to move to Kansas, and the pasture was holding them well. The land felt different. It felt like something with a future, and this was a feeling Inez had not had in several years, and it was so strange and so welcome that she carried it carefully, the way you carried something you were not sure you deserved. She was washing the supper dishes one evening in late September when Andrew appeared in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand, and a look on his face she had not seen before. He looked, she thought, like a man about to do something he had talked himself into against better judgment. "I want to say something," he said. She set the dish down and dried her hands and turned to face him. The lamplight was warm and the kitchen smelled of coffee and the last of the good tobacco she kept for visiting company and occasionally used herself on bad evenings. "Say it," she said. "I know what we agreed," he said, "and I'm not asking to change any of the terms of the arrangement. I want to be clear about that first." "Noted," she said, "but I think you should know that somewhere in these 3 months I've stopped thinking of this as a business arrangement," he said. He said it the way he said everything difficult plainly, without decoration, looking directly at her. I think about this land as ours in a way that isn't only practical. I think about the work we do here as something I want to keep doing. And I think about you in a way that has nothing to do with business and every chance of making things complicated. The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp flame shifted in a draft from the window. Complicated, she said. I'm not asking for anything, he said. I just don't want to be a man who keeps things hidden from you. You've had enough of that. She looked at him across the kitchen for a long moment. Outside the window, the September night was cooling fast and clear, and the creek was running strong after the late rains, and somewhere on the ridge a nighthawk was calling in its high wheeling arc. Andrew, she said carefully, I am a widow of 4 months' experience with the complexity of the male interior. I am in partnership with a man I've known for 3 months. I am not foolish. I know you're not, he said. But I am not unaffected, she said, and the word cost her something, but she gave it anyway, because she had told him at the beginning that there would be no secrets on her land, and she was not about to make herself the exception. I notice that I am not unaffected. I am simply not ready to know what that means yet. Something shifted in his face that she would think about later in the dark. Not triumph, he was not that kind of man, but something like the easing of a held breath. That's more than fair, he said. Good night, Andrew, she said. Good night, Inez. He went out. She stood at the stove for a while with the warmth of the lamp, and the night sounds coming through the window, and the particular sensation of being a woman who has just been honest about something difficult and survived it. October came, and with it the first anniversary of Walter's death. Inez spent the morning alone at the small wooden marker in the east corner of the property, where she had buried him with the help of 2 neighboring ranchers, because the town had been too far and the October heat had not been kind. She spent an hour there, and said the things she needed to say, some of them angry, some of them sad, some of them simply observations about how complicated love became when it was also a reckoning. She said that she had found out more about his hidden life, and that she had made her peace with it, which was the closest thing to the truth she could manage. And she said that she hoped wherever he was the fear had left him at last. Then she walked back to the house and found Andrew in the yard splitting wood with the patient, steady rhythm she had come to associate with the sound of this place, and he looked up when she came through the gate and then looked at her face and set the axe down. He did not say anything. He simply handed her the coffee cup he had balanced on the fence post, which was his own coffee, still warm. She took it and drank it and handed it back. Thank you, she said. Of course, he said, and picked up the axe again. She stood there for another minute watching him work, the clean arc of the axe and the split of the wood and the ordinary beauty of someone working well at something useful, and she thought, this is what I wanted, not the grief and the secrets and the years of managing a frightened man's hidden debts. This, the creek and the ridge and the work and someone who handed you their coffee without making a production of it. She went inside and started dinner and felt, for the first time in a year, something that was genuinely close to peace. The matter of Harlan Mote did not resolve quietly. She had known it would not. Men like Harlan Mote did not accept defeat from women they had expected to break, and the foreclosure had been as much about satisfying an old grievance as it had been about the money. She had seen his face when she had gone into the bank 2 days after Andrew paid the debt, gone in deliberately and alone, to retrieve the deed and sign the final paperwork. He had looked at her with the particular smile of a man recalibrating his approach rather than abandoning his objective. In November, he bought the old Pryor land adjacent to their eastern fence line. This in itself was not aggressive. Land changed hands in this country with the frequency of weather, but Harlan Mote then let it be known through the county gossip that he intended to route his cattle drives through the eastern road, which ran within 50 yards of the Lockhart property's best water access, and would, through the volume of Mote's cattle, effectively contaminate the creek access she depended on for the winter. He's doing it deliberately, Inez said. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the county map spread between her and Andrew and a lamp burning against the November dark outside. "Yes," Andrew said. "He can do it," she said. "The road is county property. He has legal access to it. He can do it legally," Andrew agreed. "The question is whether we can make it inconvenient enough that it's not worth doing." She looked at him. "How?" "The easement on the eastern road passes through the old prior land before it reaches ours," he said, tracing the map with one finger. "Moat just bought the prior land, but I doubt he's checked whether the easement rights were properly transferred in the sale." She leaned forward over the map. Their shoulders were almost touching, both of them bent toward the lamplight. She could smell the cold air on him from where he'd been outside checking the evening stock. "If the easement wasn't transferred properly," she said slowly, "he'd have to go around to the south road, which adds 6 miles to any drive." "It's worth finding out," he said. "Do you know a lawyer?" she asked. "I know one in San Angelo," he said. "Not well, but well enough." She looked at the map and then at him, close in the lamplight. His jaw had the evening shadow on it and his eyes were on the map, working through the problem, and she felt a warmth toward him that was no longer frightening, quite. It was still complicated, but it was not frightening. "Write to him," she said. The lawyer's name was Theodore Alcott, and he came out from San Angelo in December with a carpetbag full of documents and the particular nervous energy of an intelligent man who had been on a horse too long. He spent 2 days reviewing the county land records and the prior property's chain of title, and on the second evening he sat at their kitchen table and pushed his spectacles up his nose and said, "The 1874 easement on the eastern road was granted to Cornelius Pryor by name and was not transferable without county recorder approval. There is no record of such approval being sought or granted in the recent sale." Inez felt something release in her chest. "What does that mean for Moat's access?" Andrew asked. "It means he bought land with a road he cannot legally use for commercial cattle drives," Alcott said with the delicate precision of a man who took pleasure in legal ironies, "until and unless he petitions the county and is granted the easement anew, which will take a minimum of 6 months and cost him considerably in recorder's fees." Inez sat back in her chair. Through the kitchen window the December sky was going purple and cold and the first stars were appearing. "Send him the letter," she said to Alcott. The letter went to Harlan Moat the following week. His response was a silence that had the quality of compressed fury, which satisfied Inez considerably. He did not pursue the petition, which told her that the cost and the publicity of the legal process were more than he was willing to absorb for the sake of a harassment strategy that had not worked. She won. She allowed herself to feel it cleanly for one afternoon, and then she put it away and got on with things. Christmas came to Redemption Flats with the peculiar combination of warmth and loneliness that frontier Christmases generated. Everyone pressed together by weather and distance into a false proximity. The town church held a Christmas Eve service that Inez attended every year out of habit, and a need for music that the ordinary weeks did not provide. She went with Delia Garrity and Delia's husband Clem, and they sat in the third pew and sang the hymns and listened to Reverend Oakes deliver his annual sermon about hope in dry ground, which had the advantage of being theologically sound and agriculturally relevant. Andrew had not come. She had not asked him, and he had not offered, and she had not examined this gap too closely. He was not a church-going man, she had understood, not from anything he had said but from his silences on the subject, which were of the deliberate kind. When she came home in the early evening the house was warm. She stood in the doorway surprised because she had left the fire low, and now it was high and the lamp was lit, and there was something on the kitchen table wrapped in a piece of cloth. Andrew was in the barn, she assumed, or on the property somewhere. She went to the table and unwrapped the cloth and found a small wooden box, made carefully, with a fitted lid, dovetail joints at the corners cut with a precision she recognized as the work of someone who had given it time and attention. The wood had been sanded smooth and rubbed with something, oil she thought, so that it glowed in the lamplight. She opened the lid. Inside, set in a piece of cloth, was her mother's silver thimble. The thimble she kept in the cedar box, the most precious thing she owned. Except that it was sitting inside this new box, in a space that had been cut and lined precisely to hold it. He had opened the cedar box, measured or perhaps simply remembered the thimble's dimensions, and made a house for it. She stood at the kitchen table with the box in her hands and her throat working very hard against something that wanted to come out of her eyes, and she won that battle narrowly. She heard his boots on the porch and composed herself. He came in and stopped when he saw her, and she could not quite manage neutral, so she did not try. "You made this," she said. "There was a piece of cedar in the barn," he said. "I had the time." "It fits exactly," she said. "I measured twice," he said, but she thought this was not quite true. She thought he had simply remembered it, remembered exactly the size of the small silver thimble she held with such particular care, and made the box accordingly. This was more intimate than measuring, and she thought he knew it. She set the box down carefully on the table. She crossed the kitchen to where he was standing in the doorway, and she put her hand against the side of his face, the evening stubble and the cold of the outside air still on his jaw, and she stood there a moment with her hand against his face. He was very still. His hands came up slowly, not grasping, just resting at her waist, as if asking a question. She kissed him. It was quiet and careful and wholly honest, and when she stepped back his eyes were dark with something that was not at all hidden and not at all frightening. "Merry Christmas, Andrew," she said. "Merry Christmas, Inez," he said, and his voice had something in it she had not heard before, something undone and new. She picked up the cedar box with its perfect fitted thimble and carried it to the bedroom shelf and set it where the lamplight would find it in the morning. And she went asleep that night with the warmth of the fire and the warmth of what had changed, and slept better than she had in years. January was cold and purposeful. They worked the way they always worked, with the steady economy of people who respected the dailiness of survival, but something had changed in the texture of the ordinary. He stood closer. She laughed more often. The business of the ranch and the business of becoming something to each other arranged themselves side by side without confusion, because they were both practical people who understood that love, in a hard country, was also a kind of work, and that was not a diminishment but a deepening. He told her the rest of the things she didn't know about Walter. He told her in pieces over weeks, because that was the appropriate pace for information that had to be received and processed against the complex backdrop of a marriage she had lived inside. Walter had borrowed from other men besides Andrew. Not criminally, never criminally, but unwisely and without disclosure. He had made financial decisions from a place of constant fear that the hidden debts from Austin would catch up to him, and this fear had made him careless and secretive in ways that had slowly poisoned everything he'd built. "He loved you," Andrew said one evening. They were in the sitting room with the fire going, and she was mending a shirt, and he was reading the newspaper she had brought from town, the San Angelo Standard, 2 weeks old. "I want you to know that because I believe it was true. He talked about you in 1876 with the particular intensity of a man who has found something he does not believe he deserves. That's different from not loving you." She was quiet for a moment with the mending in her hands. "Loving someone and being honest with them are not separate options," she said finally. "Not between people who have chosen each other. He could have told me. I could have helped him manage it. I was not fragile." "No," Andrew said. "You are very much not fragile." She looked up at that and found him looking at her with the warm, steady regard she was learning was the most characteristic expression of his face when it was fully at rest, when he was not managing any presentation. "Is that a compliment?" she asked. "It's an observation," he said, "and also a compliment." She went back to the mending. She was smiling, and she did not bother to conceal it because there was no one to conceal it from except Andrew. And Andrew she was finding she wanted to show things to rather than hide them from, which was a new and extraordinary thing. In February, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the morning, which was characteristic. Not at sunset with the light dramatic over the ridge, not over a candle-lit supper that would have required candles she was not going to pay 50 cents for at Garrity's. He did it in the morning in the kitchen, before the coffee was properly done, standing in the doorway with his coat on because he'd just been to check the stock. "I want to marry you," he said. "I've thought about it for 2 months and I keep coming back to the same place. I want us to be a family on this land. I want to build it together, and I want to do that as your husband rather than your partner, although I also want to still be your partner." She was standing at the stove, and she turned and looked at him with the full attention he deserved. "What if I said no?" she asked, not because she was going to, but because she needed to know the answer. "Then we would continue as we are," he said, "because what we have is already worth more than anything I've managed to build in my life. I would not leave and I would not be resentful, but I hope very much you won't say no." She looked at him in the early light, the man who had fixed the gate first, the man who had made a cedar box from memory, the man who handed you his coffee when you'd been to stand at a grave and came back with nothing on your face and everything in your eyes. "I won't say no," she said. He smiled then. Not the careful near smile she had catalogued so many times, but a real one, wide and unguarded, and it changed his face in a way that made her feel she was seeing something very few people had seen. She went to him and kissed him in the kitchen doorway with the morning cold still on his coat, and the coffee burning slightly on the stove behind her, and neither of them mentioned the coffee for several minutes. They were married in March, in the Redemption Flats Church on a Thursday morning, with Delia and Clem Garrity as witnesses and Reverend Oakes officiating, with the particular benevolent satisfaction of a man of God who likes to see things come right. Theodore Alcott came out from San Angelo for the occasion, which surprised her and touched her because he had no professional reason to make the trip. He said that he had a stake in the happiness of his clients, and she suspected this was only partly true, and that the rest of it was that he had watched 2 careful people build something real, and found he wanted to be present when they sealed it. Inez wore her best dress, dark blue wool, and the silver thimble was in the cedar box on the bedroom shelf at home where it would wait for her return. She carried no flowers because it was March and nothing was blooming yet, but Andrew had folded into her lapel a sprig of the cedar from the barn where he'd gotten the wood for the box, and the small, sharp scent of it was with her the whole morning. He said his vows in the plain way he said everything important, directly, without flourish, with the weight of real intention behind each word. She said hers and felt them land in her body as true in a way that no vows had landed before. Afterward, Delia cried and said she never cried at weddings, and then cried more. And Clem shook Andrew's hand with both of his own hands. And Theodore Alcott produced a bottle of whiskey from his carpetbag that he said he had brought for precisely this eventuality. And they drank it in the church yard in the March cold, and it was the best whiskey she had tasted in her life, which she suspected was partly the whiskey and partly everything else. They drove home in the wagon in the afternoon, with the sky going wide and blue above the ridge, and Andrew held the reins with one hand and her hand with the other the whole way home. Spring came to the Calloway place. She had put both names on the gate, Lockhart Calloway, and Andrew had not suggested otherwise, with the particular intensity of a West Texas spring, everything erupting at once after the winter's repression, the grama grass going green and the creek running high, and the mesquite putting out its yellow blossoms that smelled like something ancient and persistent. She planted the garden early. Andrew built the additional fence that extended the south pasture, which they needed for the 20 head they now ran, 12 of their own stock and 8 purchased in February from the Delacroix Ranch. The cattle were healthy, and the spring grass was good, and the accounts in the ledger that Inez kept with meticulous care showed a property moving towards something that could properly be called solvent. In April, she told him she was pregnant. She told him at the creek in the early morning, where she had gone to fill the water bucket and had stood for a long moment looking at the running water and the cottonwoods going pale gold green with new leaves, and when she heard him coming behind her she had turned and said it simply, because that was how they said important things. He stood very still for a moment. She watched his face go through something complex and then arrive at somewhere uncomplicated. He came to her and put his arms around her and held her at the creek bank with the water running past and the spring morning enormous around them, and she felt his breath against her hair, slow and steady. "All right," he said, which was not all the things he felt but was his first word for it, and then he said the rest. "I didn't know I wanted this until right now. I want this very much." "Good," she said into his shoulder, "because it is very much happening." He laughed. She felt it in his chest before she heard it, and she thought, "I will always want to feel that first." The county knew within 2 weeks, because this was Redemption Flats and Delia Garrity had eyes in the back of her head, and a social obligation to the dissemination of joy, which she took as seriously as she took the dissemination of gossip. And in this particular case, the two were identical. There was another visit from Harlan Mote, which she had expected and Andrew had prepared for. Mote came in person this time, unannounced on a June morning, on a horse that cost more than her first year's cattle, and he came with a different kind of offer than the last time. He made a proposal to buy the eastern section of the property at what he called a generous price, and she recognized as a low one, and which she declined in approximately 40 seconds. Mote looked at Andrew, who was standing slightly behind and to the right of her in the yard, with the particular frustration of a man who had expected to deal with a widow and found himself dealing with a partnership, and said something about how she might want to consider more carefully given her condition. The silence that followed was of a specific quality. Andrew said, very quietly, "I'd ask you to be careful with your next words, Mr. Mote." Mote looked at him and recalculated and left without his next words, and that was the last time he came to the Lockhart Calloway property. The baby was born in November, on a cold, clear night with a half-moon over the ridge, with the midwife Mrs. Petra Sandoval from town in attendance and Andrew in the hall outside the bedroom door, pacing with the careful, controlled energy of a man managing a terror he did not intend to show. It was a boy, 7 pounds, and loud about it from the first moment, with dark hair and the particular look of a baby who has opinions already and intends to express them. Andrew came in when Mrs. Sandoval called for him and stood at the bedside and looked at the boy in Inez's arms with an expression she had no word for, which was unusual because she was precise with words. She said, "He has your hands." Andrew looked at the small clenched fists and then at her, and she saw him swallow hard against something. "What do we call him?" Andrew asked. She had thought about this for months, turning names in her mind. She said, "James." "My father's name," Andrew said, and she knew it was. She had remembered it from something he'd said in passing, and she had kept it. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her with their son between them and the moonlight coming through the window, and Mrs. Sandoval discreetly occupied with the tidying up, and he put his arm around her shoulders with the careful tenderness of a man holding something he knew was irreplaceable, and she leaned into him with James Walter Calloway. She had decided on the middle name herself, for Walter's better qualities sleeping in her arms, and the creek ran outside in the November night, year-round and steady, exactly as promised. The first year with James was the kind of year that reorganizes everything else in retrospect. Sleep became a different currency. Time rearranged itself around his needs. The work of the ranch was still the work of the ranch, but it was now conducted around the edges of a presence that demanded and rewarded in equal and unpredictable measure. Andrew was not awkward with the baby. She had wondered about this, some men were, and she would not have judged him for it, inexperience being a legitimate condition, but he was not. He held James with the same economy of movement he brought to everything, without fuss, and the baby seemed to recognize this steadiness and respond to it with the pragmatic acceptance of a new person assessing who can be trusted. She watched him walk the yard in the early morning with James on his shoulder, the baby against the line of his neck and jaw, Andrew talking quietly about the fence line and the state of the south pasture and the quality of the morning sky. And she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and felt something so large and so settled in her chest that it made her eyes sting briefly. She had packed her bags. She had been 3 steps from the wagon, going to Abilene, leaving everything, and a man on a dun horse had come through the broken gate and offered her, not the thing she had expected, not rescue or charity or even kindness, exactly, but a reason. A reason organized around a practical reality. The land, the water, the partnership, the honest accounting of 2 people's combined resources. A reason that had become, without her quite noticing the moment it crossed the threshold, something much larger than a reason. She thought about this sometimes. Not always, not obsessively, but sometimes with the grateful precision of a person who understands what a near thing certain happiness can be. The second year James walked and said words, and had opinions about horses that Andrew obligingly accommodated. She found a good mare at the county sale in Abilene. She went herself, with Andrew, their first trip to the city since the wedding, and the cousin Marjorie who she had intended to retreat to was located through the hotel and came to supper with them and pronounced Andrew surprisingly sensible for a drifter, which was the most Marjorie ever offered anyone. The mare's name was Ruby, which James mangled to something between that and something entirely else, and Ruby endured him with the patience that good horses extend to small humans as a professional courtesy. The second summer was the best growing season in 6 years, rain arriving with regularity and restraint rather than the usual either flood or drought of the region, and the garden was abundant past all expectation. Inez put up more preserves than she could fit in the smokehouse and sold the surplus at the Garrity store for cash that went into the ranch account and felt, as she recorded the figure in the ledger that evening, the precise satisfaction of a thing done well. Andrew bought her a proper writing desk for the accounts. He found it at the general goods auction in Comanche in October, a small slant-top secretary desk in walnut that was in reasonable condition and fit the corner of the sitting room exactly. She had been doing the accounts at the kitchen table, and he had watched her and said nothing for months, and then one day the desk appeared. He set it in the corner and said nothing about it, and she sat down at it and ran her hand over the walnut surface and said, "Where did you find this?" "Comanche auction," he said. "It was either that or a plow part we don't need." "The plow part might have been more practical," she said. "Maybe," he said, and the non-smile that she had come to love more than most people's full smiles was at the corner of his mouth, and she turned in the chair and took his hand and pulled him down and kissed him in a way that settled the question of whether the desk or the plow part had been the right choice. Theodore Alcott came for Christmas that second year, making it an annual event apparently, and he and Andrew played cards by the fire and she beat them both at euchre 3 games out of 4, which she felt was important for the record. In the 3rd year of their marriage she told him she was pregnant again in the same place she had told him the first time, at the creek in the early morning, and this time he took her hands first before she had even finished saying it and said, "I was hoping." The second baby was a girl, born in August into a summer night warm enough to leave the window open, and she had Inez's coloring, dark eyes, and the particular quality of attention that Inez had apparently carried since birth according to everything her father had ever told her. James, who was 2.5 and deeply sovereign over his territory, inspected his sister with the particular concern of someone encountering a rival for the first time, and then, after a moment's deliberation, pronounced her acceptable by touching her hand very gently with one finger, which Mrs. Sandoval said was the most dignified response to a new sibling she had ever witnessed in a toddler. They named her Clara Rose Calloway. Rose for no one in particular, simply because it was true of her from the beginning that she was the kind of person who would grow toward whatever light was available. The property by this time was genuinely prosperous by the standards of Comanche County in 1885, 40 head of cattle, a full smokehouse, a garden that Inez had expanded in 3 directions, and which provided enough surplus for consistent Garrity sales. A sound house with a new roof that Andrew had put on in the spring with the help of the Delacroix brothers, who came for 3 days and were fed generously in return. And the accounts that showed a property in the black for the first time in its history. Harlan Mote had sold the prior land to a family from Missouri in 1884 and departed Redemption Flats for San Antonio, where Delia Garrity reported he had taken a position with a railroad company, which seemed the appropriate fate for a man of his particular character. Inez allowed herself one moment of satisfaction at this news and then moved on entirely. The gate was always fixed now. It had been fixed and reinforced, and painted the particular dark red that Andrew had decided on in the second summer. And the name on it, Lockhart Calloway, had been carved into a piece of cedar by Andrew's hands in the first winter, and hung beside the gate post where it weathered and darkened over time until it looked as if it had always been there, as if the name and the land had grown together from the beginning. In the evenings when the children were asleep, which was the quiet heart of each day, Inez and Andrew sat on the porch in the cooling dark or by the fire in winter, and they talked about everything and nothing with the ease of people who have learned each other so well that silence is also a kind of conversation. He told her once, in the 4th year, that he had been afraid when he rode through that gate the first morning. Not of her precisely, but of the situation, of the possibility that he would arrive and find something irrecoverable, that whatever obligation and conscience he felt toward Walter's widow would result in an encounter that was sad and finished and left him riding on with nothing changed. What happened instead? She asked. He looked at her across the porch in the evening dark. You told me the road was that way, he said, and then you offered me terrible coffee. She laughed. He watched her laugh with that expression she had no word for, and then he said quietly, I was not prepared for you. No one is, she said, with entirely serious self-knowledge, and he laughed, which was still the best sound she knew, and the evening settled around them with the creek running in the dark and the first stars appearing above the ridge. James turned 5 in November of 1886 and was escorted to his first day of school at the Redemption Flats schoolhouse by both his parents, which was not universally the practice, but seemed to the Calloways like the appropriate weight for the occasion. He went with the particular combination of excitement and concealed terror that characterized all the best ventures, and he did not look back from the schoolhouse door, which Inez noted and felt proud of, and then felt briefly lonely about, which she was told by Delia Garrity was entirely normal, and was in fact the primary experience of motherhood from kindergarten forward. Clara, at 2.5, stood in the schoolhouse yard watching her brother disappear through the door, and then looked up at her father and said, with complete authority, I go. In 3 years, Andrew said. Clara's expression indicated that 3 years was an unreasonable imposition, but that she was prepared to hold her position under protest. Inez looked at her daughter's face and felt, as she frequently did when she watched Clara think, a recognition so complete it was almost uncomfortable. The walk home was one of those October mornings that West Texas offered sometimes as if in apology for the rest, the air cool and clean, the sky enormous and blue, the ridge golden with the last of the season, the road dusty and familiar beneath their feet. Clara rode on Andrew's shoulders with her hands in his hair, and the imperial posture of someone accustomed to the highest vantage point available, and Inez walked beside them and felt the full, ordinary, extraordinary weight of her life as it actually was. Not the life she had imagined at 19 in Savannah, not the life she had agreed to at 24 in Abilene. Not the life she had been trying to abandon on the morning when a man on a dun horse had come through a broken gate with a debt of conscience and no particular plan. This life, this specific, hard-won, improbable, beloved life. She reached up and took Andrew's hand where it steadied Clara's ankle at his shoulder, and he curled his fingers through hers without looking down, because he was watching the road and watching Clara, and he already knew where her hand was because that was how 6 years had made them. And they walked home in the October morning to the land that had always been worth staying for, to the creek that ran year-round as she had always known it would, to the house with the walnut desk in the corner, and the cedar box on the bedroom shelf, and the names on the gate weathering together into permanence. In the spring of 1887, when Clara was 3 and James was 6, and the south pasture was holding 45 head, and the garden was already promising, Inez sat at her walnut desk on a Saturday afternoon with the accounts spread before her, and a cup of proper coffee at her elbow, and the sound of Andrew and the children in the yard coming through the open window. Clara's high-demanding voice and James's slightly older authority, and Andrew's patient responses to both. And she opened the ledger to the income page and ran her finger down the column of figures. The numbers told a story of accumulation, of care compounded over time, of the thing that happened when two people brought everything they had and paid attention, and did not hide from each other. The ranch was worth 6 times what it had been on the morning she had loaded her bags. The cattle were healthy. The property was sound. The debt was long gone, and the account showed a balance that was not wealth by any extravagant measure, but was stability, the particular freedom that comes from knowing the ground under you is yours. She closed the ledger and went to the window. Andrew was in the yard with James, who was showing him something in the manner of 6-year-olds who have been at school long enough to have things to show, and Andrew was listening with the same quality of attention he brought to everything she valued about him, real attention, not performance, not patience that was secretly impatience wearing a polite face, but genuine interest in what the small person in front of him was saying. Clara was sitting in the dirt of the yard with the purposeful expression of someone engaged in important dirt-related research, and the cat, a large orange tom that had arrived from somewhere the previous autumn and had organized the household around his preferences without anyone quite agreeing to it, sat beside her with the philosophical companionship that cats offered as their highest expression of regard. The afternoon light was angled and gold across the yard. The mesquite along the fence line was in new leaf. The mockingbird was running through its catalog in the cedar tree by the porch. The creek was audible if you listened, a low, steady conversation with itself, year-round and reliable. Inez Lockhart Calloway looked at her yard and her husband and her children in the gold afternoon, and felt the thing she had felt growing toward for years arrive fully and completely in her chest, without condition, without the careful management she had applied to every good thing since she was 12 years old, and learned that good things required managing. She did not manage it. She let it be entirely what it was, which was happiness, real and present and continuous, the kind built day by day from ordinary honest materials, the kind that had no hidden debts and no secrets in separate pockets, the kind that could be handed to someone in a coffee cup on the morning after grief without ceremony or explanation, and trusted to mean exactly what it meant. She went out to the porch. "Andrew," she said. He looked up from whatever James was showing him. The afternoon light was on his face, and his eyes were the gray-green of the creek in the good seasons, and he looked at her the way he had always looked at her when she came toward him, like someone watching something they had not expected to be given and had been careful with ever since. "Come see what James found," he said. She came down the porch steps and across the yard and stood beside him and looked at what James was holding in his cupped hands, a Luna moth, enormous and improbably green, wings opening and closing in the slow, patient rhythm of something not yet quite ready for the air. They all looked at it for a moment. Then it rose from James's hands in a long, unhurried arc, climbing the afternoon air above the yard, above the fence line, above the mesquite, going up into the enormous Texas sky, and they watched it until it was gone. "Where does it go?" James asked. "Wherever it needs to," Andrew said. Clara said from her position in the dirt without looking up from her research, "It comes back." Andrew looked at Inez over the heads of their children with the particular expression of a man who finds his life regularly more surprising and more good than he has any logical reason to expect. And she looked back at him with everything she had, which was considerable, and the creek ran in the late afternoon beyond the fence line, steady and permanent, exactly as promised, as it would run through every season they were given, which turned out to be many. The gate bore both their names. The land was theirs by honest work and honest partnership, and the particular grace of having been, each of them, ready for the other at the exact moment they needed to be. The bags she had packed on that July morning were unpacked and had been for years, their contents absorbed back into the life of the place, indistinguishable from everything that belonged there, which was to say everything, which was to say completely and finally home. The evening came down across the ridge in shades of gold and rose and the deep particular blue that preceded the stars, and the Calloway family went inside to the lamplit kitchen, and the door closed against the Texas dark, and from the creek came the sound of water over stone, running clear and cold and uninterrupted, as it always had, as it always would, carrying everything it touched a little further toward the place it was going, which was forward, always forward, into whatever came next.